Getting letters on screen is one thing, but getting them the way that you want them to look and spaced the way that you think they need to be spaced is a little bit different. Here I have some lettering on screen. It's just letter spacing. I did it all in caps so that you can see the spacing a little more easily. And in object properties, instead of focusing on the letters section, we're actually going to go down to the spacing section. We'll deal with the middle section first. And I want to look at line spacing to start. And line spacing is the adjustment of space between lines of type. If I measure, so I'm going to grab my ruler and I'm going to click and drag from the baseline of the first line to the cap height of the second. And if I look, if I don't stutter on the mouse, it's 0.1 inch. And you can see that that's exactly what we have here. If I change that, so let's go to 0.5, let's make it really dramatic, and I hit apply. Now if I measure from the baseline of the first line to the cap height of the second line, it is 0.5. So that is what we are measuring, is that space between the baseline of the first line and the cap height of the second line. And that's line spacing. In other programs, you may see this be referred to as leading, and that's because in the days of typesetting type, where there's letters and all that kind of in the blocks of wood and all of that, those lines of type were, well, they were separated by lines of lead. So if you wanted more room, you added leading. So that's what we've got going on here. The next one that I want to look at is horizontal spacing. And horizontal spacing in a more traditional sense is referred to as tracking, and that's going to adjust the space between all of the letters. So everything's going to just track out. So here we've got horizontal spacing. I'm going to add 1/2 inch of horizontal spacing, and that's going to add 1/2 inch of spacing between each of the letters. And that's in addition to any spacing adjustments that were made for the typeface itself. Now, the difference between horizontal spacing or tracking and kerning is that kerning deals with individual pairs of letters, whereas horizontal spacing deals with all of the letters. Okay, so the next one down is vertical spacing. So I need to take all of this back to what it was before. And vertical spacing deals not with the space between lines, but it adjusts the space between letters vertically. So it essentially stair steps it. Now, what's really crazy with this is if you have multiple lines of type, so I'm going to remove that second line of type. There we go. And then let's go back into spacing and let's adjust. And let's do maybe 1/4 inch. And now it will space each letter 1/4 inch above where the previous letter was. If I wanted it to go downhill, I could put a negative number in here. There we go. And so here's a nice example. We've got that baseline coming through, and you can see that with that blue line. Notice that the top of the E here is in line with the bottom of the L here because we are at 1 inch letters, and we're dropping 1/4 inch every time. So by the time we hit 4 letters, we've dropped a full inch. So that's going to line up that way. This is something that I don't run into in traditional typography very often, but it is relatively common in embroidery. So I can stair step up or stair step down through a word, and it's often handy for things like band, cheer, track. Shorter kind of teams can pull that off. If you end up with something like basketball, it just gets really big and crazy. So here I've got some lettering again, but this time I've chosen an older alphabet whose, well, its kerning could use a little bit of help. It's a little bit spacey here. It's a little bit gappy here. Yeah, it could use a little bit of help. And I could go through and I could use these kerning marks in the lettering box to adjust that. But With a lot of letters, I may choose to have it automatically do that for me. If I go back into that spacing, I can turn on auto kern. And what auto kern does is it changes the space between the letters to be a percentage of the height. So when I hit apply, everything just evened out. It became a percentage of the height, and that can work really nicely for me. So it's automatically adjusting the space between all of the letters, actually each pair of letters, which is why it's kerning. Oftentimes, one of your customers may want to put an extremely long name or an extremely long phrase in your embroidery, and it's hard to kind of fit all of those letters into the space that you have. Well, horizontal spacing, that tracking, can be used with a negative number to kind of squish letters closer together. Auto kern can also do the same thing by reducing that percentage. So you could take that percentage down to 5% of the letter height, and so everything just gets that much closer together. So if you combine horizontal spacing and or auto kern with those numbers reduced, with maybe a little bit of your letter width kind of reduced, you can start fitting larger words or larger lettering elements into smaller and smaller spaces without kind of shrinking everything down so much that it's hard to read. Now that we've got the lettering spaced really nicely, the space between the words looks a little bit rough. And that's where I can adjust with word spacing. If I uncheck use the default, which uses the glyph for the space, well, now it too can be specified as a percentage of the height. So I can adjust that between any words that I have, and I can adjust that down or up depending on what I want the look for this lettering element to be. So auto kern and word spacing are really, really handy automatic tools that I can use to quickly adjust a lot of things. Little caveat though, they work really, really well. Specifically, auto kern works really well with serifed and sans serifed, basically block typefaces, but it can really throw you for a loop if you're trying to use them with a connected typeface. So connected scripts, for instance, have one letter that flows into the next letter. Well, if I'm using auto kern, there's going to be a space between all of those letters, so it will take a really lovely connected script or a shaped monogram and really throw all that out the window. So here I have Melody Script. It's lovely, it's connected, it looks beautiful, but if I had left auto kern on as my default, look what happens to my lettering. Everything just falls apart. There's a space between all of my letters, and definitely not what I'm looking to do. The same thing would happen with a shaped monogram. So if I turn auto kern on, for this lettering it looks nice, but as soon as I go to a monogram, let's do a seal. And this, it spaced it out. It doesn't look quite as nice. And if I were to go in and add a border, you can see on the side it's getting a bit pinched, whereas on the top and bottom you can see the spacing as it's supposed to be. So auto kern's a really handy tool for those blocks, serifs, sans serifs, but I would not be using it on connected scripts or those shaped monograms. All of those tools that you've looked at combined give you a huge assortment of options for dealing with the spacing of individual pairs of letters, as well as the overall spacing of your letters and lines of text.